So it's my pleasure to start the symposium this afternoon. We've got a reasonably busy schedule, and we'll try to keep on it. So I'll just start by introducing Richard Leakey. I've known Richard for quite some time in a variety of capacities, and I think this is the first time I've ever had the capacity to introduce him as a speaker. Richard, take it away. Human evolution and climate change. Give us your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Terry. Well, I don't come with any paraphernalia. I don't have any PowerPoints, nor very many ideas, so it'll be a very simple talk. And it'll be somewhat perhaps disjointed. I was in London yesterday for dinner, and I'm feeling a little bit unsure where I am at the moment. But we'll do what we can. I think there's several points I want to make, and if you like, I want to be somewhat rhetorical, somewhat questioning on some aspects of this. Was a symposium, and we were told this morning because NSF got behind it, it's now a workshop. So I would like to find out the difference, but you'll tell me later. The title I proposed, and under pressure, was Human Evolution and Climate Change. Is there evidence for a direct connection? And I think the answer has to be, thus far, no. I haven't seen the evidence. As Mikhail said in his opening talk, there must be. But do we have it? And I'm not sure that we do, and I'm not sure we necessarily mean the same thing when we talk about human evolution. And I may be rather simplistic in saying this, but there should be in evolution evidence of quite a significant change in terms of the way an organism copes with its life, in adaptation, an adaptive response to a changed way of life forced on it by environmental pressure of one kind or the other. And I guess the best forcer of environmental change is climate. So I think let's start at that point and then take the question of human evolution, for which a great many people, myself included, have spent a lot of time wasting a lot of trees, publishing papers with other trees that we draw. And the question in this issue is, are the trees we're drawing depicting human evolution, or the changes in our thinking about some fossils that have been found over the years? And I'm not sure that we're necessarily prescribing a story that is an evolutionary story rather than a story of our interpretation of the use of names and words and timeframes. And when, as recently as last week, I read something that must have been no more than a week old, where on one, quote, camp, people talk about Kenyanthropus platyops as a distinctive entity in the story of the pre-human record, and another camp refers to it as just another version of A. afarensis. You're left with, well, what is a biological version? Is it a species? Could it be an evolutionary moment? Is the use of totally different specific and generic terms an indication of weak minds on both sides, one side, or what is it? And I think one needs to ask these questions, and I'm deliberately pushing this because I think in terms of the story of our being here today, there can't be that many things that are really in the sort of biological evolutionary lexicon examples of major adaptive responses to an environmental change. And I would be willing to try my hand at going through a couple of these and ask what the evidence for the connection is. Having said that, I would like to emphasize that I was struck this morning by the capacity that has grown out largely from Turi Serling's work to actually apply new tools to answering the question. And I think the specificity of the work that is now being done and the evidence for the C4, C3 issues, some of the the oxygen isotope work. I mean, there are a number of things coming out that should enable us to test some of these issues. But again, I wonder whether the terrestrial record on its own is necessarily fine-grained enough to see what we're talking about. And I would like to come back to the point that was made earlier, and that is we are only dealing with the evidence where it has been preserved. And that is, in terms of Turi's slide of 1%, one tree on a large piece of open grassland, if you put the sedimentary deposits and cave sites from the whole of Africa, covering the last 6 million years, onto a map of Africa, you wouldn't get near 1%. I mean, it would be a fraction, a minute fraction of the African landscape that we're talking about, although we assume that life lived, and amongst that life, primates of different kinds, including pre-humans and early humans, lived elsewhere. And we are stuck with this very, very narrow vision. But having said that, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to assume that what you see around the shores of the Awash, or what you see around the shores of Lake Turkana, or what you see in the caves of South Africa, are necessarily oddities for what was going on in a much bigger landscape that you're not sampling. And I think one has to recognize that there probably is no reason to doubt that the evidence we're finding is typical of that time in a broader area. Now, whether one can say that what was happening in the more temperate parts of Africa, north and south, Ethiopia and the Transvaal region of southern Africa, as opposed to the warmer parts of East Africa represented by the Rift Valley sites, is a different issue. And I think we need to look into the impact of rifting, the impact of doming, the impact that has had on weather patterns, monsoonal patterns, precipitation patterns, and vegetation patterns. And I think there's a lot more to be learned about that. But coming back to the main points that I think we need to be looking for, I mean, I think we would all accept that standing upright, walking habitually on two legs, is not only an odd way to move from A to B, but it must represent a very, very significant moment in time in terms of an adaptive response to something. Now, we are learning that there was a huge change in the C3, C4 issues, the big story to tell around the CO2 levels at that time. But I think we know very little about the late Miocene in terms of other fauna, and very little about the late Miocene in terms of some of the other things that may be going on that could add to our understanding of why suddenly in the fossil record you have a bipedal model of primate locomotion. And I say a bipedal model of primate locomotion because you could argue till you're tired whether that happened once, it happened twice, or this gave rise to that. But I think we need to be a little more precise than I think is currently the trend in some circles. The anatomists that I grew up knowing, people like Alan Walker, and before him Philip Tobias, and before him Michael Day, and before them people who worked with my father down in South Africa, used to speak quite specifically about having a foot that didn't have a big toe that stuck out at right angles to the foot. And that was the model for habitual bipedalism. And if you had a foot that stuck out at right angles, the suggestion was that it couldn't have been used as a habitual biped, although just as an arboreal ape can walk on the ground, it periodically must stub its little big toe, but it doesn't swear loudly, and you don't know what it feels like. But I think, to me, to then say that if we're finding feet with a foot like that, that it's another example of an early hominid diversity, I mean, are we not making our life much more complicated than we need to? And I would argue that, strictly speaking, bipedalism requires a foot not unlike ours. I'm being simplistic, and you know, Eric, don't worry. You've known me as a simplistic man all your life, so don't worry about that. But I think that is a fundamental adaptive point that we should be trying to understand first. Secondly, I think the next thing that is perhaps possible to record is the evidence for a significant change in the way we collect our nutrients, our food. And in this respect, I would say the use of stone to make stone that cuts flesh is important. Yes, birds can stick sticks into holes, and chimpanzees can whistle up termites and do all sorts of other things, but I think cognitively it's a very distinctive step. Did it happen once or several times? Who knows? Do chimps go and use stones to break nuts on top, sitting on other stones? Yes, periodically. But is it different or the same from hominids that were making flakes to a set and regular pattern? Is it different from finding cobbles that have been broken into 37 or 38 flakes in an area about the size of this podium, and one flake has been gone away with and the rest you can piece back together except for that flake? I think that's different. It's hard to quantify empirically, but I think we are not just empirical thinkers. We are thinkers, and I think there is a significance to that step, and it must speak of something that has happened up here. Whether it is the bigger brain relative to body size, whether it's the development of certain areas of the brain, we still don't know. But irrespective of all of that discussion, which will be endless, what caused it? And when did it happen? When did it happen, we will find by the archaeological record. We were hearing earlier on about some of the sites in Ethiopia at 2.6, and did something come down and start it there, or would we expect to find it further back? These are questions that more research will answer. But what was it that triggered that response? Because that response had enormous implications to the way that creature was then able to provision. And the late Glyn Isaac was amongst the first to talk about this, when he said, if you're out collecting these little seeds, or little berries, or whatever the other ideas people have, perhaps you can't do much sharing, and you have a problem in nurturing infants who are very mother-dependent at an early stage of life, because later on they need to grow a bigger brain. So I think the advent of stone technology in at least one lineage, and I would favor one on the evidence that we have, but I may be wrong, but this is significant. But why? Is there any evidence that climate change impacting on the environment forced that second step in the story that we want to tell? I don't know, but I think it's something we haven't heard much about. We may be getting the tools to look at that, and I think it's worth doing. Thirdly, I think there's this idea that, and I do not wish to sound in any way pejorative, and but I want to make the comment that when we move away from shattered seeds from the grasses, we come very quickly to the slide we were shown of zebras and animals that we hunted. And we hunted because we ran jolly fast after them. So long limbs, striding limbs, athletic form, high off the ground, and all of these ideas are there. But is it that simple? Recently we did an experiment at the Turkana Institute where the field school did an assessment of biomass inside and outside an exclosure. The exclosure is where we have the field school. It's about 100 acres. And outside it is the area that the people still use today, and they've herd goats and other livestock. The biomass of insects inside the property exceeded the biomass of mammals outside the property. And you don't need to be off the ground and running very fast to catch an ant. You don't have to run very fast to catch a beetle. You may have to run very fast to catch a butterfly. But if you're clever, you'll wait till the sun sets and then you can pick him off the leaf. And we were clever, obviously. So I think we want to be careful not to oversimplify the opportunities that were there and not create theories that fit rather simplistic views of the habitat in which this was happening. Whether it's on the edges of the lake or whether it's on the highlands, it must have been more or less the same. So I think the dietary question is a complex question, and I pose the question to Turi. All right, so we're talking about C3 and C4, and we're making a lot of that, but not much has been done in Africa about the impact of a diet of grasshoppers that eat grasses and the impact of a diet of beetles that eat leaves. And are we getting a C3, C4 differential signal in the enamel of these early hominids based not on that they were eating little seeds or eating animals that had eaten lots of grass, but they were eating caterpillars and bugs, which is a very satisfactory diet year-round in much of Africa, whether you're in the forest or on the open savanna. And if you're out in the open savanna with a less than 1% tree cover, and there's enough grass because you haven't got domestic animals, you can usually scrape around and in a relatively short order begin to accumulate quite a few things. But leave that as it may, what I think is very significant is that at some point about 1.8 million years ago, and you can argue when, but it doesn't really matter, hominids, or a hominid, an hominid, having just come from England, turns up in northern Europe. That must have required the capacity to deal with all sorts of environments to which it hadn't had previous experience. And this must be technology. So what do we know about that next moment in the evolutionary story? And this seems to me central to answering the question that is posed in the title of my talk. What do we know as to why it was that hominid that went out to Europe 1.8 million years ago did very little in terms of further change, further adaptation that will be a signature in the fossil record, and there was a period of what they call stasis that lasted a very long time. Do we know why? Do we have any evidence that deals specifically with that, given that there's a background of extinction going on all over the world, given that there's a background of microclimate change all through that time? How were the hominids responding to that in the places they had reached? And they must have had to respond differentially in the far northern climes as they would to the way they would have responded on the shores of Lake Turkana, which was still there then. So this is another aspect of the question that I think we need to adapt our research focus, to use some of the tools that have been discussed this morning, will be discussed this afternoon, to actually look specifically as to whether those questions can be answered, because that seems to be important. And then I guess finally you come to the most obvious and the most difficult question, and that is, if hominids were around and we find quite clever hominids apparently living in Asia and Europe and China and the sort of old world back 100, 150, 200, 250,000 years ago, what is this then that the genome tells us that we all come out suddenly again from a mere 45 to 60,000 years ago? What drove that last population that totally repopulated our planet, with the exception of possibly a few Neanderthal genes that were taken in a certain part of the world? Does that speak of evolution? I would suggest it probably does in terms of an adaptive capacity, but is that an adaptation that we'll find a record in the fossils? An important question. But in terms of the evolutionary story of us being here today, I would see those as the major landmarks that we should be addressing. And yes, climate change, and I think Mikhail was absolutely right, it's not climate change per se, but the impact the climate is having on where we're living and how we're living, whether we're a giraffe or a butterfly, but it is the environmental conditions. And we're beginning to learn a lot about that, but we're still stuck with looking at the minutiae of the approach and the technique and not looking at the big mega questions. And this is why I still think that you might get a better signal if you can match some of the deep ocean cores on climate change, which you can interpret as must have having had an impact on environmental conditions. And we're now getting the data coming in from some of the work that Turi and the other speakers this morning have alluded to, that you can actually begin to see how you might specifically deal with components of that. That, I think, is the challenge for the coming decade. This is what I think should come out of a conference like that, a recognition that we know a hell of a lot more than we did 5 years ago. But there's some questions we haven't even begun to look at, either because we haven't dared ask them, or because we didn't dare because we didn't know how we could answer them. But I think we're getting to the point that we can. And that would be my challenge. The final point I would make is that the evolution of hominids, or evolution of our species within the hominids, is important, but it cannot be seen as something entirely separate from other mammalian changes that are taking place in the same habitats at the same time. And I think we too often divorce ourselves from this. The only place where I think we may not be able to go further is once we develop a sophisticated technology, we may no longer be subject to the same rules that apply to giraffe and baboon and pigs. And once we've got a mind that can think that we need to carry water because we're going over an area where there may not be any for the next 5 days, and we can carry it in skin bags or things like that, for which we have no evidence at all. But the fact that we don't have any evidence for it doesn't mean it probably didn't happen. It almost certainly did, because there's certainly hominids that got to places quite quickly in ways which you couldn't understand unless they had a mind that was doing it. Once you have a mind that can make a skin bag and carry water and carry provisions for a journey, you move out of your environment. Your human environment, your social environment, is also subject to some changes. And perhaps you're seeing the beginning of the domestication of a species in the first technological species, which was our forebears. Fairy tales, probably. But in my 45 years of attending these meetings, I have heard so many, I don't think it's necessarily more outrageous than the previous one. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions?
Yes.
If the idea that maybe if climate change didn't influence human evolution, then what should we be looking towards for the drivers of human evolution, if there are any? So if we want to explain human evolution, what else should we be exploring to try to understand it?
Naomi, I think again, it may be a generational gap, but I think you misunderstood what I was saying. Of course, climate change has influenced human evolution. The question is, do we know how it's influenced those specific events? Do we have the record of those few moments in evolution? And if you're dealing with some of these South African fossils that are primitive Homo at 1.9 million years, and you've got well-developed, established Homo 150, 200,000 years earlier, well, what happens to the sort of philosophical sequence that we use that we think of when we use terms like primitive? I'm much more interested in the bigger picture than the little picture. And climate change per se can only influence the environment. The environment is what's going to change the organism. And I absolutely would agree it has to be environmental change forced by climate. But are we in a position yet to say how that influenced the first appearance of bipedalism? Are we in a position to say how that influenced the development of technology and encephalization, migration out of Africa, and ultimately the question of the last breakthrough in the last 60,000 years. What do we know about that? And can we actually refine that? On environmental data, yes. But on climate data, terrestrially, probably no. And that's why I think what Peter's trying to do and establish a link between the marine and the terrestrial is so important, because if we use them together, we might get much closer to understanding some of the little signals that you may be picking up in your work.
One more question?
How about major events? Something like the Toba eruption, a huge volcanic eruption that fractures not only the environment, but the species. Huge drops in population so that the species now is fragmented, and the evolutionary inventions that are taking place, genetic inventions, can get a hold. The desiccation of the Mediterranean, for example, so close in time to this.
Well, when you say how about it, I'm all for it, but what evidence do we have that these massive volcanic eruptions have had an impact on the community of species in which hominids were a part over the last 4 million years? There is no direct linkage between volcanicity and the spread of tufa and climate change and these major events that I'm talking about. Did they have local events, local implications? No question. Did they have implications that went far beyond? And remember, Africa is not just that thing you see on a map that looks quite small, but it's a pretty large place, and it would take a hell of a lot to get to force a species that was probably pretty widely distributed to undergo those changes.
But would you have to force that species wide, or would you have to take one little segment of that species, and that event puts it in a isolated microenvironment? For example, with the desiccation of the Mediterranean, dwarfism appears on all these Mediterranean islands afterwards. It had. So is there something that lets this genetic change take place without being diluted by a larger population?
Well, there could be. I wouldn't rule it out. But the point I would make is that we have not yet any evidence for it in terms of our own story. The last 60,000 years may well lend itself to such an idea, because the hominids that preceded the modern genome represented across the world was remarkably similar, and one's hard-pressed to think of what caused a very wide distribution of something very like ourselves to give way to ourselves, where you could, skeletally, I think you would agree, many of you, that you couldn't separate them. And yet they're not in our genome. So what happened, and certainly nothing I have seen in the lithic record, the archaeological record, nor have I seen anything in the literature that calls down on an event that the genetic work suggests took place in what is now Eastern Africa, around the north end of Lake Turkana. So you can have what if, but there's no evidence for it. And so this is where I think science should focus, because these are unexplained questions. And for me, it's the unexplained that is the challenge. The second challenge is to check whether the explanation is truthful or right, but that's secondary. And thirdly is try to be remembered as having been part of what's right and forgotten your part in being wrong. Thanks very much.
And the Red Queen hypothesis was initiated by late Lee Van Valen back in 1973, and it was the idea that it was interspecific interactions, competitive exclusion type of interactions on a broader scale that drove species adaptations. And followed by my dear friend Elizabeth Verba in the 1980s, and then culminating in 93 with her paper on turnover pulses, argued that in fact it was climatic change, environmental change, that was the driver of speciation change, or speciation events, or even of adaptations, morphological adaptations within lineages, oftentimes which paleontologists would interpret as speciation events. And she argued that there were these climatic changes that took place, and these caused pulses of speciation events and pulses of extinction events that we should be able to determine and see in the fossil record. And I think that this idea that she promulgated in the mid-1980s has permeated much of what we've seen in terms of the climatic interpretations even today. And it's been culminated recently in a paper by Mark Maslin and Martin Trauth in 2009 in a wonderful book. If you don't have it, I suggest you get it. It was published in 2009, where they postulated a number of changes in the climatic record, the development of lakes, changes in carbon isotope ratios, dust records, fluctuations in temperature. And if you look at this graph, what I'm always struck by in these types of graphs is, yes, there's a lot of variation here, and there's a lot of variation here, so that the variation here must relate to the variation there. And this is kind of a pattern that one coming into it, from my perspective, being a hominin paleontologist, if I can call myself that, and not somebody with expertise in any of these other records, is oftentimes wondering whether it's the correlation of variation that one is seeing rather than any specific kind of event. This was taken in 2009, and in development, taking this paper 2009, you'll see we've got here these lakes that appear, these blue features are the lakes that appear in East Africa, and the bars are taken to correlate with the beginning origination of a species, or an origination of a lineage, or the demise of a lineage, and certain things such as the development of stone tools and things like that. This was 2009, and I was surprised in 2011, the same graph appeared, but the number of lakes changed. And what we see here now is the correlation with the origin or extinction of lakes relating to the origin or extinction of hominid lineages. And one wonders about whether there is really a correlation here, or whether there is, in fact, beyond that, whether there's any degree of causation. Not to say that climate and environmental change hasn't obviously had an impact, but I think it's a question of trying to get down to the nitty-gritty of what it is that's actually changing in the hominin fossil record in response to these variables. This is a slide from Peter Domenico's work, and again, we see changes in climate clearly going to be correlated at some degree with changes in the fossil record. But my worry is, looking at the hominin fossil record, that the changes in the hominin fossil record are oftentimes internal rather than having anything to do with external forces. Let me give you some examples. We take a problem with speciation and extinction events, which are oftentimes used by climatic modelers, and for good reason, because one would like to explain this pattern of speciation and extinction in the record. But there are problems. The vagaries of the fossil record affect the first appearance dates and the last appearance dates for any species. These vagaries also affect the record of speciosity, as we will see, or I hope I'll be able to demonstrate to you. And vagaries of interpretation affect speciosity as well. So if we take a look at, for example, at the first appearance dates and the last appearance dates, prior to 1996, when this maxilla from Hadar was published as the earliest specimen, 2.3 million years of Homo habilis, or some form of Homo, the earliest fossil Homo that was on record was 1.9 million years. Well, you think to yourself, at 1.9 million to 2.3 million isn't a real big difference, but it's a couple 100,000 years, which is, in the terms of the hominin fossil record, a fairly substantial period of time. So it's with new discoveries we will find fossils that change the first appearance date and the last appearance date. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to correlate or explain what we see in the record today and just give up, but I just want to bear in mind that these dates do change. We also have vagaries of the fossil record affecting speciosity. And this goes back to 1994. I could go back earlier, and it doesn't include all of the most recent fossils, but just in the last 15 years, we have 6 or 7 new hominin fossils. It's about an average of 1 every 2 years, or depending on if you need something published in Science, it's more often than that. And so one finds that 15 years ago, these species didn't exist, so a large portion of this graph would be non-existent, which means that any correlations that were being made at that point in time between climatic variables and the hominin fossil record would subsequently change, about on an average once every 2 years. That, again, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to draw correlations, but I think we just have to bear in mind that these dates, these species numbers, and the first appearance and last appearance dates are transient. They're even more transient based on the vagaries of our interpretations of the fossil record. For example, the black skull was discovered in sediments dated to 2.5 million years ago. And Alan Walker and Richard Leakey they looked at it and said, this is a robust australopith, and it looks very much like Boisei, and it does indeed look very much like Boisei. So they argued that the Boisei group, or Boisei species, had an origin at 2.5 million. Others of us have looked at these fossils and said, well, there are some subtle differences between them that we can recognize, we can diagnose these differences possibly, so we would separate this group, these early robust australopiths in East Africa, into 2 separate species. So automatically we have the difference between 1 or 2 species in East Africa based on exactly the same fossil record. Similarly, the material that Meave Leakey discovered in East Africa that's been attributed to the species Australopithecus annamensis, and the material from the Hadar, the better known sample of Australopithecus afarensis, has been argued by several people to represent an anagenetic lineage. And it's been even argued by Johannes Haile Selassie most recently that, in fact, there's no reason to distinguish 2 species in this lineage. So again, if we have 1 species or 2 species in a lineage, it's going to differentiate the kind of environmental impact that one might correlate to that lineage. And then, of course, species like Australopithecus sediba that's just been found in South Africa. It's a question of whether Australopithecus sediba is any different from Australopithecus africanus. If it is, then it means that something else was going on in South Africa that has to be explained. If it isn't, then it means that correlations to sediba are going to be rather fruitless. So we have these problems of the interpretation of the fossil record with speciation and extinction events. So if we have problems with extinction and speciation events and species definitions, perhaps we could look at the relationship between climatic variables and hominin evolution in terms of the paleo-environments that those climates are going to change or drive, and the effect that those paleo-environments might have on the hominins that are inhabiting them. So we might look at species or lineage adaptations to specific paleo-environments. Well, I don't want to be a nabob of negativism, but again, we have some serious problems here. One is with the environments. Which paleo-environmental reconstruction do you prefer? And then the second is with the determination of specific adaptations to any given environment. And I'll give you some examples, I hope, that might illuminate the point. We've already heard this morning that there are 2 very different interpretations of the Aramis paleo-environmental parameters based on exactly the same data. Now, Tim White's group would argue that there is no evidence to associate this hominin, Ardipithecus ramidus, with more open-wooded grasslands or grassland savanna. They saw this as a forested environment. If one were to look at variables for adaptation in Ardipithecus, one would then be looking for forest variables, or variables in a forested environment. Using exactly the same data, Terry Serling, in his group in Science, noted that, in fact, Aramis has a higher fraction of grass and is more open than any other hominin bearing sites older than 4 million years. 2 very different interpretations based on the same data. Again, if one were to try and look at the adaptations of Ardipithecus ramidus, one has to determine whether these adaptations were to a grassland environment, or a more open environment, or perhaps a more forested environment, or some mosaic. So we have these problems of environments. And because Eric Delson reminded us that South Africa has fossils. I thought I'd throw in a fossil slide for South Africa. The same appears in South Africa, where we have one specific site of Sturtfontein. And depending on whether you like bovids, you can look at the overall fauna, you can look at the rodents, you can look at macro botanical remains or primate fossils. We can go from medium density woodlands, gallery forests, open savannas. So we have a variety of habitats that can be inferred depending on what animal or what proxy you're using for those paleo environments. It may well be, as Naomi mentioned, we have a mosaic environment here, and that would be something that would be equally interesting. But again, it's a question of what is the actual environment that we're using as a proxy for adaptation. And I'd like to speak about adaptation. Two examples of adaptations and hominin paleontological inference about adaptation in terms of human or hominin evolution. So let's talk about specific adaptations in hominins. Australopithecus annamensis, found in eastern Africa, a paper by Margaret Schoeniger and her colleagues on the isotope records, the carbon and oxygen isotope records, suggested that, I'd have to use my glasses even to read it from here. What did she suggest? She suggested that the setting matches expectations for the selected advantages of a nut-eating bipedal hominid, in this environment. So that would explain why Australopithecus annamensis looks the way it does. Gabrielle Macho and her group undertook a finite element analysis of tooth enamel. This is what I'm going to talk about, teeth. This is it. Well, no, I'll talk one more thing about teeth. Looked at tooth enamel, and looking at the structure of the tooth enamel, determined that it was well adapted to resisting fracture. So Gabrielle Macho and her group concluded that from both a finite element analyses and dental microanatomy leads us to suggest that Australopithecus annamensis is probably adapted for habitually consuming a hard, tough diet. So we have now morphological evidence that is in concert with Margaret Schoeniger's reconstruction of the environment. If we look at Australopithecus annamensis in terms of what it actually ate as opposed to what it might have been adapted to eating, and again, there are only 3 specimens that we have evidence for in this group, in this species. What we find is that the microwear on the molars, and there have been, to my knowledge, no carbon isotope analyses of this species, but the microwear on the molars of the annamensis specimens falls within this little circle down here, which is exactly within the circle of gorillas. Gorillas don't eat hard objects. So what we have is a microwear signature on the molars that doesn't match what the predictions from the morphology are. Perhaps there are other explanations. Maybe the morphology is adapted to fallback foods that we're just not sampling on the 3 specimens that we have microwear for. Perhaps the adaptation is in an earlier part of the lineage, and once you've got teeth like this, you can do just about anything you want to with them. They're good to maintain, and so you can eat grass, or not grass, you can eat leaves and celery and fruits like gorillas do, or you could eat hard objects. What we have here is a cautionary tale. Another cautionary tale I'd like to give you is my favorite animal, Paranthropus boisei. And Paranthropus boisei, when you look at it, it's a bipedal cuisinart, and it's probably capable of doing anything it wants to with its teeth, short of shearing meat off of bones. And any number of biomechanical models from the original biomechanical models of Yoel Rat, we're looking at facial design and pulling the cheeks and the masseter muscles, the muscles of mastication, up over the tooth row and increasing the size of the tooth row at the back here, and getting rid of the incisors and canines, came up with a model that we were exerting high occlusal forces on whatever was being eaten. Obviously, kind of idea of being able to process very hard, tough objects. And we can go from this rather elegant model to an even more elegant, sophisticated model developed by a former graduate student of mine, Dave Straight, and his colleagues, I don't know what happened to Dave after he left Stony Brook, but he sort of went off the rails a bit. But they've come up with these finite element models of the Paranthropus boisei cranium, indicating that it was capable of generating high strain values and high pressure. So we have biomechanical models, which would indicate, along with perhaps the paleoecological evidence, that this hominin was adapted to eating hard objects. But if we look at the microwear on the occlusal surfaces of these teeth, including Zinj from OH5 from Olduvai Gorge, this is what the occlusal surface of their teeth look like. Now, this is what the occlusal surface of a monkey that eats hard nuts looks like, and this is what the occlusal surface of a gorilla or a Therapithecus baboon looks like. You don't need to quantify this. This is why I do this. It's the any fool, including Fred Grein, can see theorem. There is not much going on here that suggests eating hard objects. So we have indications again in boisei of the actual use of these teeth not being consistent with what the evolutionary scenario, perhaps the adaptations, the morphological adaptations of the animal, and the paleoenvironmental reconstructions might indicate. Again, as with Anamensis, it may be a lineage feature that appeared much earlier on, and once you have a set of teeth like that, you can do anything you want to with them again, except for shearing meat. And you might think, well, we've only got a few of these specimens, and maybe it was all fallback foods, and so we're really sampling something that is an ephemeral and erratic type of occurrence, that it just so happens that the 8 specimens of boisei that we have this data for look like this, but the rest of the time they were doing something else. Well, Terry Serling and his group and Nick van der Merwe and his group have sampled 24, I believe, boisei specimens now, and all of the boisei specimens that have been sampled fall up into this range, which is, to my understanding of these numbers, a high C4 diet, something around 70 to 80% of their diet being C4 plants, not C3 plants as we find in nuts. These are the animals down here that would be eating more C3, although except for these hominins here, this entire group is really C3. But what we have here in boisei is something that's completely different, C4. And to go back to what was said earlier this morning, it may well be that we're looking at dietary adaptations to the types of C4 plants that are out there, not masticating. It's not a question, as Alan Walker put it many years ago when he first proposed that boisei wasn't eating hard things, and nobody believed him, including myself. He suggested that rather than asking what it is that boisei was eating that was so hard, we should be asking what was boisei eating that required so much chewing. And so it may be a different way of looking at the adaptation in terms of not only what was the species doing, but how would this relate to the climate or the paleoenvironmental indicators that we would propose. So I would just, again, not wanting to be a nabob of negativism, I would just propose that we look at this fossil record, and rather than trying to draw correlations which may not equate to causation, and I haven't spoken about the large picture items that Richard mentioned, such as bipedalism, brain size, and tools. These are small adaptations that I'm talking about, what animals did with their teeth. We should be a little bit more cautious. So to explain the title of my talk, How the Hominins Got Their Teeth, I took from, with apologies to Rudyard Kipling in his Just So stories, as, for example, How the Elephant Got Its Trunk. Thank you very much.
Time for a couple of questions.
You and Richard have both raised a critical issue in evolutionary biology as it pertains to environmental biology, which is we're the masters of generating just so stories, and we have to come up with tools to link actual adaptive change to a given selective pressure. So in the case of C4, I have 68, 70 lineages to work with, and I can do a comparative analysis on a whole range of different levels. We don't have that with the genus Homo. You've thought about this a bit. What kind of approaches can we use to go beyond just so stories and correlative sorts of things, or are we limited to that? For example, can we use the molecular analysis of the human genome compared to the chimpanzee genome and look at specific genes that we know are adapted to a certain environmental behavior or feature?
That's a very good question. We are very limited, and you're quite right. I've thought about this a bit, like for about a week, because I was asked to come in and give this talk about a week ago. So I haven't really thought about how we're going to get out of this too much. My suggestion would be along the lines that you propose, and that is we have a depauperate species lineage, even depending on how many species of hominin there are. If we can use other animals as proxies or as analogs for the hominins, then we might be able to get some idea of what was going on and what the hominins may have been doing. But I think that is one of the biggest problems, that we have a depauperate lineage. Paul?
So to actually respond exactly to that comment, which is I was going to make this comment as well to when Richard was speaking. There are certain key sets of genes that make humans functionally unique from chimpanzees. For example, the FOXP2 gene, which is located on chromosome 7, which is a homeobox type gene which organizes speech in human beings. It's actually only 5 mutations away from a mouse, and it's only 2 mutations away from a chimpanzee, as near as I can tell. Now, it's amazing. A single point or 2-point mutation can lead to a totally different organizational structure and patterning of speech. So rather than looking at whole genomes, which has been done, I mean, this has been done we know exactly the human genome, we know exactly chimpanzee genome. But finding patterns for teeth structure is very, very, very difficult in the human genome. But finding traits that are, which is going back to what Mikhail was talking about this morning, specific traits that make humans unique, I think we can do that and compare how many SNPs, how many single nucleotide polymorphisms had to have occurred from a chimpanzee to a human. Knowledge of that allows you to actually clock in a pretty fundamental way how long it would have taken to break out from that break. We obviously are missing stuff in the middle, but it tells you at least the sequence of events that had to have occurred to lead to human beings. Okay?
Look at mining the human genome is one way to go about looking at this. The problem with the mining the human genome is that you have very few changes between us and chimpanzees. They're mostly in cis-regulatory mechanisms. If you start to get down to the specifics and you're looking at things like, perhaps, like you mentioned, teeth that are related to diet, you start to look at the differences in the human genome that are related to diet. They're either very late, so that they are things such as lactase persistence or apolipoproteins, things like that, that are going to appear much later in the human record, probably with relationship to origins of agriculture. Or you're going to end up with big differences that relate to the differences between us and chimpanzees. For example, differences in chimpanzees and humans in some of the, we all have bitter taste receptors, but we have different bitter taste receptors than they do. So it's a question of you've got very deep differences or very recent differences in the human genome that relate to things like dietary change. And if you are asking about the hominin fossil record, we're talking about things that either occurred 7 million years ago at the split or somewhere along the way, and we don't have any way of knowing when they occurred, or things that occurred in the Holocene. So the genome is kind of a problem because it's the big gap is the area where we're actually interested in.
It's a neutral mutation, but what I'm saying is that if you could focus on the traits, to go back to the specific traits that differentiate us from chimpanzees. So complex abstract thought, which is what Richard was talking about before, and then horizontal information transfer, right, which is what we're doing now, in an abstract way. Those are very small subtle mutations, and I think those are the differences really we should be focusing on. Not on the whole human genome versus the whole chimp genome, which I agree with you. We've done that, and most of these are transpositions, most of these are, genes that are not really relevant to what we're discussing.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to keep on time so I don't get too big in trouble with Peter. So next speaker is Matt Sponheimer, Forest, Trees, and Islands on Environment and Common Evolution.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful symposium/workshop. And what I want to do today is something a little different. I want to dance around a bit around the intellectual niches of the various speakers. And as a result, therefore, thus the oddments up there. I want to talk about a few things, but some of it's going to come to issues of scale in talking about these kinds of questions. And some of it really is going to come down to issues of why it is important to talk about biology and ecology when we are talking about issues of hominid evolutionary biology, which is really ultimately what we're talking about today, climate and human evolution. I also then want to close with a few parting shots on perhaps the nature of our inquiry into the relationship between climate and human evolution. Let me see if I can get this to actually work. Okay. I just also wanted to preface this by saying in some ways what we're doing here is not that different from what people who are trying to model what climate change is going to be doing to taxa in Africa in the next 100 years. Right? I mean, I'm not going to talk to this, but the bottom line is there are a variety of models here, and it looks pretty bleak for Africa. Okay? So going from there, though, one of the issues with these is people worry, how reasonable are these? And a lot of the concerns about these are the same kinds of concerns that speakers have talked about today, and I'm going to talk about today, as to how biologically reasonable these things are. What are some of the things that people worry about with this? Well, how does plasticity come into play? How do microhabitat preferences come into play? These tend to minimize things like biotic interactions. Okay? So these are all things that people who are doing climate projections and people who are interested in understanding the impacts of climate in the past have in common. Okay. Oh, I wasn't supposed to go there. I ruined it. What I was supposed to be doing right now is telling you, let's go with the old familiar story. We go from relatively closed, wet habitats, and things open up. It becomes open, it becomes dry. Climate has changed, environment has changed, and there are new adaptations as a result. Things like bipedalism, which enables a lot of things. One, it's a thermoregulatory advantage. It potentially increases energy efficiency. It allows organisms, this particular organism, to gather up food with its forelimbs and carry them back someplace else. It's a really nice, adaptation story. And I was going to say, so we all know the organism we're talking about. You're supposed to say, of course, hominins, but I'm not. These are kangaroo rats. And it is amazing. It's not exactly an isomorphic argument, but a very similar argument has been made about things like the development of bipedalism in kangaroo rats. These are found in very xeric, sort of desert environments. And they have a number of other traits for this. They're very good at minimizing water loss, a variety of other things. Now, one of the nice things about studying something like the origins of bipedalism in kangaroo rats and sort of what bipedalism means in kangaroo rats is that, well, there are rodents in deserts all over the world that have adapted similar postures. You can look at this independently in a number of places and try to get at what might be leading to these adaptations. As I believe Rowan just mentioned, we don't have that luxury with early hominins. And so once again, I think this speaks to the issue that we do really have to be careful with the nature of the stories we tell. So this was sort of a bit of an early cautionary tale. But I just want to briefly go into a little bit of history. No one's done that much on this today. Darwin, in very general ways, talked about things like how habitat change could impact human evolution. But one of the really important early discussions of this comes from Raymond Dart's seminal 1925 paper where he names Australopithecus africanus. And a lot of us are familiar with the fact that, well, he found Australopithecus africanus, and it's an early hominin because, well, he noticed things like smaller canines and relatively higher forehead position, inferred position of the foramen magnum, suggesting bipedalism. What people tend to not talk about in this paper is that environment was a big part of it. And one of the things that he noted, despite these human-like tendencies, this is still a very ape-like creature in many ways. Right? And it was found here, on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. So the question he asked is, how does an African ape of one sort or another survive in an environment so inimical to that of its forest brethren, like chimpanzees and gorillas? And his answer to this was omnivory. But so he thought that environment was key in sort of setting us on a different path. And he thought ultimately, changes in cephalization and structure of the brain were involved here too. Now later on, some people say he went a bit off the rails on this and went on to argue that some of these hominins had an osteodontocratic culture, a bone, tooth, and horn culture, and were able to bring down large prey and take down saber-toothed cats and, of course, each other. He had some very lively phrases on this. Now, the reality is this is probably a more typical hominin-carnivore interaction at the time. And people like Bob Brain were instrumental in coming to this new vision. An unpleasant one if you're SK54, which this is modeled off of a juvenile skullcap. But, so what I want to do now is start talking about some of these bigger issues. I mean, what do we really know about this stuff in homin evolution? And at one level, when we talk about sort of what's happening with communities at hom sites, I think there's a lot of agreement, actually. You go back to sort of Australopithecus afarensis times, back at the beginning of this chart here, taken from Kay Reed's work. Well, you see fewer grazers than you do later in time, right? You see more things that are moving around in trees, generally speaking, than you do in recent time periods. And you see relatively more frugivores. So it seems like there's a change in these general assemblages, arguably these communities. Okay? Exactly when this happens, whether or not it happens lockstep from one region to another, what about the complexities of basin to basin? I mean, these are all interesting questions. But most people agree that there is a trend. Most people believe that there are obviously macroevolutionary forces at work here. But really what I want to get at is, okay, that's fine. Let's say obviously some of its taxa moving in and out as habitats change, but there can be in situ evolution as well. But that's sort of, metaphorically, that's our trees. That's our broad scale look at things. But now let's go from the forest to the tree. And in the tree, in this instance, is hominin evolution. And let's look at just what happened to hominins. Let's not talk about what happens to these assemblages. And I think where we might have sometimes a fairly clear picture as to what happens with a large group, it might be very difficult to get at what happens with any individual taxon. Okay? So, and if I'm going to take that metaphor further, I can also channel Kant and say, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight has ever been made. And I think that's probably the case in talking about hominin evolution and climate. What's there is probably extraordinarily complex. So let's do a thought experiment. Pan on our left, Papio, baboons on our right. We are in a large, continuous forest. Forces are at work. Fragmentation occurs. Eventually, we go from an area that was dominated by trees to an area with just small little bits of trees here and there, but a largely open landscape. Okay, well, let's assume this happened. We know this. But how is that going to impact these creatures? Well, I would argue that probably not in similar ways. Let's look at baboons. We know they're widely distributed across Africa. We know that they have very different diets from place to place. This is just to give a plug, some stuff that Daryl Kodrin and I've done with some of our colleagues in South Africa, just showing in one little part in Kruger Park how over the course of a year, the feces of these guys change and the amount of C4 vegetation. I don't have to go into C3, C4 with all we've had today. But the amount of probably grass changes from month to month in the diets of these guys. In one population, enormous swings, sometimes from month to month. These guys are capable of eating most of what's out there. They're really remarkable. When we talk about how this translates to things like habitat use, Turi had a Tana River earlier, which is very fortunate. Let's go back there, and let's talk a little bit about the overlap of the Tana River mangabey with Papio there. Well, in the wet season, so you can see right here, basically the ranges of those two species overlap almost entirely. There's not much difference. There's a fair bit of dietary overlap as well. Okay. Go to the dry season. Well, one of the things that stands out, the mangabeys don't change what they're doing very much in terms of habitat use. Okay. The baboons, massive change in the way that they are utilizing the landscape. Now, interestingly, when you look at diversity measures for diet of these mangabeys versus the baboons do not actually have greater dietary diversity. Okay? The mangabeys during the dry season do augment their diet with a variety of things, everything from birds' eggs to reptiles and things on occasion. Okay? What's key about the baboons is the kinds of new things that they go into and their willingness to use these open landscapes in ways that the mangabeys don't to a large extent. And as a result, unfortunately, these mangabeys and just about all mangabeys are highly threatened with extinction because they tend to be very localized. Chimpanzees, they don't have quite the same problem of a lot of mangabey species, but still they're much more limited in what they will use in the landscape than our baboons. This is just a quick look at their hair carbon isotope compositions. But these are from 3 different savanna environments here. As you can see, there is not much in the way of variance. Shockingly little, considering that there are reasonable sample sizes there. Chimpanzees know what they like, and they like doing it a lot. And I'm going to show you a slide later on that gives you a good sense of this. Now, if this is important for modern taxa and our thought experiment, if we agree that Pan and Papio might have different challenges when we go from a forest to a much more open environment, then clearly these are things we have to be thinking about when we're talking about early hominin taxa. I'm just going to pick one out here, Boisei, and I'm not going to talk about it in any depth at all. We've already had that. I just want to point out that obviously we all know about its adaptations. They've come up. Some people argued, well, nuts, Nutcracker Man, we know the story. Okay, read the book. Now, what do the isotopes tell us about this? If we look at the far right here at Boisei, the one thing that jumps out is Boisei does look different than anything else that we have for early hominins. Other thing that's just shocking is it looks a heck of a lot like something like that, like a zebra or a warthog or a hippo. Remarkably C4, shockingly so. A couple of other things that worth mentioning here. There's clearly diversity here. Ardipithecus is much more on the C3 end of this continuum. Exactly what percentage C3 it consumed, and we can debate that. Reasonable people can disagree, but it's clearly primarily a C3 eater. I throw this line here just to show that is a line of the mean line for fossil giraffids found at the sites where these hominids were also found. Okay, so it gives you a pretty good end member of what the C3, pure C3 eater probably looks like. Yeah, reasonably. Now, Boisei is eating a lot of C4, and some of those other taxa are eating a lot of C4, at least some individuals are. What could this mean? We don't have to talk about this in a lot of detail, but they could be eating things like C4 grasses directly. They could be utilizing certain types of aquatic or semi-aquatic plants like Cypress papyrus. They could be eating animal foods, such as certain termites, particularly if you're looking at termites of the genera Trinovertermes and Hodotermes, the so-called harvester termites, which eat a great deal of C4 vegetation. Things like Macrotermes tend to eat less C4 vegetation, though they'll eat a lot as well. Or, of course, you could be eating small vertebrates, lizards and the like. When it comes to something like Boisei, I tend to not be a believer that it was eating a lot of animal foods. Now, How might we get at this? Very briefly. I mean, the isotopes don't allow us to distinguish between those alternatives. I will point out that there are other potential proxies that would let us go there. Andy Sillen, for instance, has argued that looking at the strontium-calcium ratios of early hominins might enable us to tell whether or not these were plant foods, these C4 things, or animal foods. And this is based upon a long-known relationship where animals tend to not like strontium terribly much. We much prefer calcium. So there's biopurification of calcium or discrimination against strontium. With the net result that your plants have good amount of strontium, your herbivores eat them, they have less. Your carnivores eat your herbivores, they have less yet again within a particular food web. All right? And so Andy looked at this for a variety of herbivores and carnivores and found Paranthropus robustus found pretty low. He suggested, well, there's probably a bit of omnivory there. I tend to think that this is a significant oversimplification, but yet, nevertheless, this is a potential way forward on these kinds of questions. So what do we know about early hominin diet? Well, I feel a lot more comfortable saying what I think we don't know about early hominin diet, and I'm pretty confident that this is not an accurate picture overall after about 3 million years ago. There may have been some individuals in these kind of environments eating this kind of food, but I think that was probably the exception rather than the rule. I think clearly there is no hominin diet. There's a lot of diversity. And as a result, when we think about climate change, we shouldn't be thinking about climate change for hominins. We should be thinking about climate change for Paranthropus boisei versus climate change for Homo versus climate change for Australopithecus africanus. I think there's no a priori reason to believe that the result of that's going to be similar. I think it could be sometimes, well, very different. Let's just give a concrete example of that. Let's go with boisei again. Let's imagine that you believe boisei got its C4 component through consumption of sedges, which a lot of people do. If that's the case, all of a sudden now you have a picture of an organism that's highly tied to wetland environments, probably. Okay? This is going to have implications for ranging patterns, how one uses the landscape, and potential dispersal. It would be very easy to imagine how that kind of organism could wind up very fragmented and unable to disperse. This also could indicate things like, well, the positive side of something like that is there's not going to be very much interspecific competition because basically nothing eats sedges to that kind of extent. Yes, there are animals that eat sedges, but nothing that specializes on them. Let's take another example. What if you think boisei ate grasses? Well, then all of a sudden you think, well, maybe this would be ubiquitous on the landscape, widely distributed, very few barriers to dispersal, but then maybe major competition with the big grazing gill. Though arguably you say, well, maybe they wouldn't be eating the same parts that grazers would. Maybe they'd be looking to seeds and underground portions. You know, possible. It's just a story. We don't really know. You could also argue, however, if they were eating grasses, and Dunbar has done just this for Theropithecus, that grasses are not great if you're a primate. And if you're going to eat grass, you better eat relatively high-quality grass. And this could lead to the suggestion that they would have been tied to grasses around wetland environments, okay, where you tend to have a lot more green flush and higher crude protein and things like that. And in fact, this is something that's been argued maybe why Theropithecus is limited, the grass-eating gelada, today to the highlands of Ethiopia, where you have relatively high C3 grass quality. So, bottom line is I think there's a lot of potential complexity. I just want to briefly talk to Ardipithecus. We all know that White et al. Has said that these guys have clearly strong arboreal adaptations and things like the grasping foot. We also know that Serling et al. Have come up and said, well, forest, not. This is something different. And I don't think the Love Fest in Addis in August really resolved this issue very much. However, I think there is room for common ground, as long as certain people aren't in the room when we discuss this. And I think where the common ground exists is that, I see no problem why you couldn't say this guy was spending a lot of time in trees. I don't see any reason why you couldn't, in fact, say that this loves forested environments. What you can't say is that the broad environment around there was forested. The isotopic evidence is not consistent with that. But I don't see why it couldn't be consistent with something like riverine. Could this be evidence, in fact, of microhabitat specialization within a broader, very open landscape? And this would not be unique. We see this all the time today. I just want to briefly point out that, how do I know the time, by the way, I have? Am I over at 3? Okay, great. So I want to point out that there might be ways to speak to sort of, microhabitat use in fossil hominins. We're not close to there yet, but there's at least reason to think in certain cases it might work. This is another example from the work of Andy Sillen. He's argued in the Sterkfontein Valley. As you're near the streams, you have a massive change in the strontium isotope compositions. And as you move away onto the veldt, the sort of open grassy area, strontium isotopes are very different. With the idea that animals that are living on the veldt will have very different strontium isotope compositions than those that are living down near the stream. Fair enough. This is probably not going to work most places, but not only things like strontium isotopes, there are major and trace elements that are known to change in certain environments along, for instance, a Catena crest to mid-slope to foot slope. There might ultimately be ways for us to get at these kinds of questions. We're not there, but we should keep an open mind. Carbon isotopes, we've heard enough about them. Let's just skip this. Gigantopithecus, Ramidus. Well, I will say this. Chimpanzees in savannas look very different than chimpanzees in forests. Shivapithecus, the Miocene hominoid, looks basically like forest chimpanzees. Let me point out that this range is expanded because some of these forest areas are places with massive anthropogenic disturbance, so I'm pretty sure some of these chimpanzees are raiding a little bit of mealy, some corn on occasion. Bonobos, Gigantopithecus from early Pleistocene China. What it's doing, we don't know, but this would be consistent with a very closed habitat. So possibly carbon isotopes can help us on this question. What do we know about afarensis? Well, by the time we get to something like afarensis, it's been argued that they were pretty much all over the place. These are potential analog environments that Kay Reed shows. So you can see some quite densely wooded, some extraordinarily open. So arguably, they can be all over in the landscape. That said, Sue and Harrison did publish an interesting and arguably quite speculative paper where they say that the relative rarity of afarensis at Laetoli versus its abundance at Hadar speaks to the adaptations of the species and the habitat tolerances and preferences of the species. They argue that Hadar was relatively more wooded and wet, and as a result, afarensis did much better in those kind of environments. Okay. I just want to spend a couple of minutes now talking a little bit on sort of biotic drivers of some of our environments, and then get to a little bit in community interactions. We have a few minutes. One thing I want to point out, climate clearly has a major influence on things like woody cover. I mean, no one really doubts that. One of the interesting things that people tend to forget, though, is you don't actually need that much precipitation to have an enormous amount of woody cover. About 650 millimeters does it. Okay. So you can see here, you get up to there, you can start having 80% woody cover, which is we're basically talking very closed environments here. However, once you get over 650, it's consistent with having everything from almost no woody vegetation to complete cover. So what's going on? Obviously, our geologists will tell us all things about sort of soil nutrient status, and we can talk to tectonics. We can also talk about things like fire, right, which is always a big one. Frequency of fire is something that I think we often don't talk about enough, because I think that's a real key. As we were discussing this morning, when you have fires coming through, if you have top kill, you don't really get these things establishing themselves. Fires come in, burn the thing down to the ground, it resprouts, and it keeps on happening. It has to either grow very quickly or have not sufficient fire frequency to allow it to get big enough to survive top kill. And then once that happens, it fundamentally changes the nature of the landscape. Now, but I'm more interested in the biotic aspects, megaherbivores. This is the one we've all heard of. Elephants, for instance, have been argued to have a major impact on vegetation structure. So much so in the Kruger National Park that they think it's justified to shoot thousands of elephants to deal with their dread effects. Now, they tend to leave out the fact that when you really look at the studies elephant damage to trees, particularly in large areas. Yes, they do damage to a huge number of trees. Tree mortality, though, is exceptionally small. One thing before I go into it, I also do mention that we had a lot more proboscideans, different richness back in the past. And I really wonder what kind of impact that had on the environment and how environments were maintained over time. Something maybe we can talk about afterwards. Mesoherbivores, so smaller animals. Well, these can't possibly, change the amount of woods and things around. But yeah, I think they can. I think probably in profound ways that we don't discuss. These ladies here are tree killers. This is an interesting hypothesis, but we have subsequent support of this from different areas. Put out in '93 that I found fascinating. They're having a problem with bush encroachment in Lake Manyara National Park. And one of the things put forth is that there were anthrax epidemics, which in some cases wiped out more than 90% of the impala population. As soon as this happened, there was major increase in shrub establishment. Okay? Not only has this been used to argue that this is having a major impact on the amount of bush today, but the same authors argue that if you look back and estimate the amount of time that some of the larger acacia stands, well, Wallachia, I guess I should say now, acacia no longer exists in Africa technically. If you look at when some of those were found in Lake Manyara and a variety of other areas in East Africa, a lot of them seem to be a little bit over 100 years old, which correlates with a major rinderpest epidemic that wiped out many of the small browsers throughout Africa. If this is the case, it has massive implications for the way we think about these environments being maintained and controlled, and various really stochastic processes in it as well. And just to show you that this is not just something out of the wind, nowadays when we do this, we do this experimentally. And this is an example of doing just that. Well, what happens if you exclude impala? What happens if you exclude kudu and elephant and do it in a variety of combinations from a plot? What happens to seedling recruitment? The number of trees basically that are allowed to grow up. And as it turns out, elephants have no impact. Kudu have very little impact by comparison. But put impala there, there's a major relationship between impala density and seedling mortality. Thus, a lot of people have argued that if you have sufficient impala and certain other browsers, you cannot have sufficient big-time tree growth in an area. And that could be a major way of, controlling environments. Okay, so communities matter. And I think I have to get to sort of my ending bit here. I do want to show one other thing. When we talk about change, we tend to talk about change as sort of this habitat loss. It's a major problem. And yes, obviously, habitat loss is a major problem. It's a huge problem we face today. I do want to point out, though, in the last decade or so, people have been taking a slightly different look at these kinds of issues and really trying to separate issues of habitat loss versus fragmentation. The primate literature has tended to treat these as being the same. They're not, actually. And this is just a good example from a very different system. This is coral. This is another experiment that was done where you can manipulate things just so. Just a 1 meter squared coral. You take it, you reduce it by 75%. Not surprisingly, the fish around it, their survivability decreases and the overall species richness decreases. None of us would be shocked by this. We see this all over the world today. Habitat loss is creating terrible problems. Okay? But what happens when we start fragmenting it instead? In fact, the opposite thing happens. They tend to survive better, species richness increases. So much so in some facts, and this isn't only in, they've done this with lots of rodents and a variety of other taxa, so much so that some people argue that fragmentation is somewhat protective against at least small-scale habitat loss. Not the kind of thing that we do to the planet, but the thing that the planet does to itself over different time scales. Okay, so I'm going to just skip that and just go to last slide. So what about the relationship between climate and human evolution? Well, I think there is a relationship. That's maybe not a very interesting conclusion in some sense. No doubt distributions on the landscape, no doubt intraspecific and interspecific competitive interactions are to some extent mediated by climate and environment. But, really the questions we want to ask is, how are individual hominid speciation or extinction events or behavioral changes linked to climate? And I think that's much more complicated. And I'm definitely a skeptic as to the specific scenarios we have out there. We say, well, our best evidence of Homo is maybe 2.3 or so, AL6661, right? And then we say, well, northern hemisphere glaciation, that's only a couple 100,000 years away with the real increase in that. And so we know that fossil record's imperfect, so what's a couple 100,000 years between friends? It's close enough. And then we say Homo ergaster, well, about 1.8 maybe origin. The Walker circulation was around there. Oh, well, that's perfect. It's right on. Okay, but whatever happened to the imperfection of the fossil record? If the fossil record was imperfect for the origin of Homo, why isn't it for Homo erectus? My point here is that I am not sure that we could find any fossil at any time that would convince us that climate is not involved. And if so, I'd love to see if someone has a particular, can counter that. But where would you have to put that new fossil and that origin to say, oh, well, climate clearly was not involved here? I'm not sure that that exists. And I would further argue that even if we invented a time machine, went back, and were able to get climatological and perfect environmental data over the last 5 million years, and came back and then had a perfect record. We can all wish, right? I am not sure that the day we had that, and for the years after having that, we would know one more thing about the impact of climate on human evolution than we do today. Why? Because in and of itself, it is going to possibly tell us very little about the competitive interactions that might be driving a lot of hominid evolution. And so I'll just stop it there, and thanks for having me.